The knock came at dusk when the Arizona sky was bleeding red and gold, and Xavier was cleaning his rifle by lamplight, half listening to the coyotes starting their evening chorus across the desert scrubland. He hadn't been expecting visitors, not out here 20 miles from Keeler where the land stretched endless and unforgiving, where most folks had the good sense to finish their business before nightfall. The second knock was more insistent, and Matthew set down the Winchester with a frown, wiping gun oil from his hands onto his worn trousers as he crossed the small ranch house his father had built 30 years ago with nothing but determination and calloused hands. When he opened the door, the woman standing on his porch looked like she'd been dragged through hell backwards. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, hanging in waves around a face smudged with trail dust, and her dress, once a respectable blue cotton, was torn at the hem and stained with what looked like days of hard travel. But it was her eyes that caught him, green as spring grass and filled with something desperate and defiant all at once. Xavier, her voice was hoarse, like she'd been breathing dust for miles. That's right. He kept one hand on the door frame, aware he was alone out here and this woman was a stranger, though something about her face nagged at his memory like a half-remembered dream. "What can I do for you, miss?" She reached into the leather satchel hanging from her shoulder and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges and creased from being handled. "My name is Margaret Gaines. I believe this belongs to me now." Matthew took the paper, unfolding it carefully in the lamplight spilling from behind him. The words swam before his eyes at first, legal language about parcels and boundaries, but then he saw the signature at the bottom, and his heart stopped cold in his chest. He knew that handwriting better than his own, the familiar slant of the letters, the way his father had always made his capital letters too large, like he was afraid people wouldn't see them otherwise. Samuel Xavier, signed and dated 3 years ago, witnessed by a lawyer in Phoenix whose name Matthew didn't recognize. And there, written in the same hand, the designation of land, his land, the eastern 200 acres that held the best water source for 50 miles. Made out to Margaret Elizabeth Gaines. This can't be right. Matthew looked up from the deed to the woman's face, searching for answers. "My father died 4 years ago. He never mentioned you, never said anything about selling off part of the ranch. He didn't sell it." Margaret's chin lifted, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. "He gave it to me. Or rather, he gave it to my mother, and when she passed last month, it became mine." The desert wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the yard, and Matthew realized he was still standing in the doorway like an idiot while this woman swayed on her feet. Whatever his father had or hadn't done, whatever this deed meant, she looked ready to collapse. "You better come inside," he said, stepping back. "You look like you could use some water and a place to sit down before we sort this out." Margaret hesitated for just a moment, then nodded and stepped across his threshold. The house was small, just 3 rooms, but it was clean and solid, and Matthew saw her take it all in with those sharp green eyes as he pulled out a chair at the kitchen table for her. He pumped water into a tin cup and set it in front of her, watching as she drank it down in long, desperate swallows. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "Yesterday morning." "Maybe." She set the cup down carefully. "I had some dried meat, but I finished it before I reached Keeler." Matthew went to the stove where he'd left a pot of beans and salt pork warming and ladled some into a bowl. He set it in front of her with a chunk of bread he'd bought in town 3 days ago, and tried not to stare as she ate with the single-minded focus of someone who'd been truly hungry. Instead, he looked at the deed again, reading it more carefully this time. The date was clear. 3 years ago in May, his father had signed over 200 acres to Loretta Gaines, Margaret's mother. The land description was precise, the legal language proper and binding. If this was legitimate, if that really was his father's signature and not some forgery, then Margaret Gaines owned a quarter of his ranch. "Tell me about your mother," Matthew said when Margaret had finished half the bowl and was eating more slowly. "How did she know my father?" Margaret's hand stilled on the spoon. "They knew each other a long time ago, before either of them married. My mother never talked about it much, but I found letters after she died. Your father loved her once, I think. Maybe she loved him too. But her family had other plans, made her marry my father instead. And my father just gave her land. Out of what? Old feelings?" Matthew heard the skepticism in his own voice and saw Margaret's jaw tighten. "I don't know why he did it. I only know that he did, and it's legal, and I've come to claim what's mine." She pulled another paper from her satchel, this one newer, crisper. "I had a lawyer in Phoenix verify it. He said the deed is valid and binding." Matthew took the lawyer's letter, scanning the formal language that confirmed what Margaret was saying. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of this, trying to reconcile the father he'd known with the man who would give away ranch land to an old love. Samuel Xavier had been practical to his bones, hard-working and unsentimental. He'd taught Matthew to shoot, to track, to read the weather and the land. He'd never mentioned a woman named Loretta, never hinted at any life before he'd married Matthew's mother. "Why now?" Matthew asked. "Why come all this way? You could have sold the land, sent word through a lawyer. Why show up on my doorstep alone?" Margaret met his eyes and he saw something fierce and proud there. "Because I have nothing else. My father died when I was 16. My mother took in sewing to keep us fed, worked herself sick doing it. When she died, I found the deed and the letters, and I realized this was the only thing in the world that belonged to me. So I sold everything we had, bought a horse, and rode here from Phoenix. 4 days on the trail, sleeping rough, because I wanted to see what was mine. It's desert and scrub," Matthew said flatly. "The only thing that makes it valuable is the creek that runs through it. Without that water, my cattle can't survive summer. Then I suppose we have a problem." Margaret's voice was steady, but Matthew could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged now that she'd delivered her message. "Because I'm not leaving, and I'm not selling. This land is mine, and I'm going to make a life on it." The lamp flickered, throwing shadows across the room, and Matthew felt the full weight of the situation settle over him. This woman, this stranger with her valid deed and her desperate pride, owned a quarter of his ranch, the quarter he couldn't live without. He should be angry, should be planning to fight this in court, to find some way to prove the deed was invalid. But looking at her sitting at his kitchen table, her dress torn and her face smudged with dust, eating his beans like they were a feast, all he felt was a strange, reluctant curiosity. "Where were you planning to sleep tonight?" he asked. Margaret straightened in her chair. "I have a bedroll. I thought I'd camp near the creek." "The hell you will. There are mountain lions in these hills and coyotes that get bold after dark." Matthew stood, moving to the small bedroom off the kitchen. "You can have my bed tonight. I'll sleep out here. Tomorrow, when we're both rested, we can figure out what to do about all this." "I don't need your charity," Margaret said, but her voice was thin with tiredness. "It's not charity. It's common sense." Matthew pulled a blanket from the chest at the foot of his bed. "You can't stake a claim if you're dead, Miss Gaines. Now get some sleep. We'll talk in the morning." For a moment he thought she might argue, might insist on her bedroll and her pride. But then she nodded slowly and stood, swaying slightly on her feet. Matthew showed her to the bedroom, leaving the lamp on the dresser and closing the door to give her privacy. He spread his blanket on the floor by the stove and lay down, but sleep was a long time coming. His father's handwriting haunted him, the familiar loops and slants that he'd seen on supply lists and letters home when Samuel had gone to buy cattle in Tucson. He'd never known his father to be dishonest, never known him to be impulsive or romantic. The man Matthew remembered had been steady as stone, devoted to his wife until she died of pneumonia 7 years back, devoted to the ranch that had consumed his life. But people were complicated, Matthew supposed. People had pasts and secrets and old loves they never talked about. Maybe there had been a Loretta once, before the ranch and the wife and the son. Maybe giving her this land had been Samuel's way of making something right, of acknowledging something that had never had the chance to be. Or maybe the deed was a forgery, clever and convincing, but false all the same. Matthew wanted to believe that, wanted to cling to the simple story of his father's life that he'd always known. But something in Margaret's eyes, in the way she'd said, "Your father loved her once," made him think she was telling the truth. The morning came too soon, sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee pulling Matthew from restless dreams. He sat up, confused for a moment about why he was on the floor, and then remembered. The woman. The deed. He scrambled to his feet and saw Margaret standing at the stove, pouring coffee into 2 cups. "I hope you don't mind," she said, looking almost shy in the morning light. "I found the grounds and figured after yesterday I owed you at least a cup of coffee. I don't mind." Matthew took the cup she offered, studying her in the daylight. She'd washed the dust from her face and repinned her hair, and he could see now that she was probably close to his own age, maybe 25 or 26. Pretty though she looked too thin, like she'd been skipping meals for a long time. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in weeks." Margaret wrapped her hands around her own cup. "Thank you for not turning me away last night. I know this must be a shock." "That's one word for it." Matthew drank his coffee, feeling the heat of it wake him up properly. "I've been thinking about this all night, Miss Gaines. If that deed is real, if my father really did give that land to your mother, then legally it's yours. But practically speaking, you can't ranch that land alone. You don't have cattle, don't have supplies or equipment. What exactly are you planning to do?" Margaret lifted her chin. "I'll figure it out. I'm not helpless, Mr. Xavier. I can work, I can learn. I was thinking I might build a small house near the creek, maybe plant a garden, raise chickens. I don't need much. On 200 acres. Matthew shook his head. "That's a waste of good grazing land. And even if you could make a go of it alone, which I doubt, you'd be sitting on the only reliable water source in this whole region. My cattle need that creek come summer or they die." "All of them." "What are you suggesting?" Margaret's voice was cautious. Matthew set down his coffee cup, the idea that had been forming in the dark hours of the morning finally taking solid shape. "I'm suggesting a partnership. You keep your land, legal and proper. But you let my cattle use the water, and I'll help you build a house, get you set up proper. We can split the profits from the herd, give you a real income instead of just trying to scratch by on chickens and vegetables." "Why would you do that?" Margaret's green eyes were sharp, searching his face for the trick, the angle. "Because it makes sense," Matthew said simply. "Because fighting in court would cost both of us money we don't have, and because at the end of it all that deed looks legal to me. My father signed it, and whatever his reasons, I'm going to honor that. But I'm not going to lose my ranch over it either. This way we both get something." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tight around her coffee cup. "I want my own house, not here on my land." "Fair enough." "And I want it in writing, this partnership. Legal and proper, so you can't change your mind later. I'll ride into Keeler today, have our lawyer draw something up." Matthew offered his hand across the table. "Do we have a deal, Miss Gaines?" Margaret looked at his hand, then up at his face, and Matthew saw the exact moment she decided to trust him. Her grip was firm when she shook, her palm calloused from work. "We have a deal, Mr. Xavier, and you can call me Margaret." "Matthew," he said, and felt something shift in the air between them, some easing of the tension that had filled the house since she'd knocked on his door. They rode into Keeler together that morning, Margaret on the tired mare she'd bought in Phoenix and Matthew on his roan gelding. The town was small, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a few other buildings clustered against the vast emptiness of the Arizona desert. People stared as they rode in, and Matthew could feel the questions in their eyes. He was known here, had been coming to town since he was a boy, and he'd never brought a woman with him before. The lawyer's office was above the general store, a cramped room that smelled of paper and tobacco. William Porter was old enough to have known Matthew's father, had drawn up Samuel's will after he'd died. He listened to their story with rheumy eyes, examining the deed Margaret presented with careful attention. "This is Samuel's hand, no question," Porter said finally. "I didn't witness this deed, but I recognize the Phoenix lawyer's name. He's legitimate." He looked at Matthew over the top of his spectacles. "Your father never mentioned this to you?" "Never," Matthew said, and tried to keep the bitterness from his voice. Porter nodded slowly. "Samuel was a private man, kept his own counsel about most things." He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "Now, let's talk about this partnership you want to set up." They spent 2 hours in that cramped office, working out the details. Margaret would retain ownership of her 200 acres. Matthew would have permanent water rights for his cattle. They would share the costs and profits of the ranch operation, with Matthew providing the initial stock and equipment, and Margaret contributing her land and labor. Porter wrote it all down in careful legal language, making 2 copies that they both signed and had witnessed by the store owner downstairs. When they walked out into the bright Arizona sunlight, Margaret looked dazed. "I own land," she said quietly, like she was testing the words. "I'm a rancher." "Partner in a ranch," Matthew corrected, but he smiled as he said it. "Come on, we need to get you some proper supplies if you're going to live out here." The general store was dim and cool after the heat of the street. Shelves stocked with everything from bolts of fabric to horse tack to canned goods shipped in from California. Matthew watched as Margaret moved through the store, her fingers trailing over the merchandise with a kind of longing that made his chest tight. She picked up things and put them down, clearly calculating every penny. "You need work clothes," Matthew said, steering her toward the ready-made garments hanging in the back. "And boots. Those shoes you're wearing won't last a week out here." "I can't afford," Margaret started, but Matthew cut her off. "It's a business expense. We're partners, remember. I need you healthy and able to work, not crippled from bad shoes and heat stroke." He pulled down a pair of canvas trousers and a sturdy cotton shirt. "Try these." Margaret looked at the men's clothing with wide eyes. "I can't wear trousers." "Why not?" "There's nobody out at the ranch to see you but me, and I don't care what you wear as long as you don't trip over your skirts and break your neck." Matthew added a broad-brimmed hat to the pile. "Go on. There's a room in back where you can change." When Margaret emerged 15 minutes later, Matthew had to work to keep his face neutral. The trousers and shirt fit her well enough, though she'd need a belt to keep the pants up, and with her hair tucked up under the hat, she looked like a young man. But there was something about seeing her in practical clothing, ready to work, that made her seem more real somehow, less like an apparition that had appeared on his doorstep, and more like an actual person he was going to be sharing his life with. "Well," Margaret turned in a self-conscious circle. "Do I look ridiculous?" "You look like a rancher," Matthew said, and meant it. They bought supplies that afternoon with the credit Matthew had built up at the store over the years. Flour and coffee and salt, dried beans and rice, a bag of seed for planting a garden. Tools: a hammer and saw, nails and wire. Fabric for curtains and blankets, a good skillet and a Dutch oven. Matthew watched the bill climb higher and knew he was spending more than he should, knew he was taking a risk on this woman he barely knew. But something about the way Margaret carefully counted out her small cache of coins, trying to contribute what she could, made him want to give her this chance. "We'll build your house first," he said as they loaded the supplies onto a borrowed wagon. "Get you settled before we start thinking about expanding the herd." "I can help build it," Margaret said quickly. "I'm not afraid of hard work." Matthew looked at her standing in her new clothes, her chin set with determination, and felt the first stirrings of something more than just curiosity. "I believe you," he said. They rode back to the ranch in the wagon, the late afternoon sun turning the desert gold and red. Margaret was quiet, looking out at the land that was now partly hers, and Matthew found himself stealing glances at her profile. She was pretty, he'd established that, but it was more than that. There was something in the set of her shoulders, in the way she looked at the harsh landscape without flinching, that drew him. She'd ridden 4 days alone to claim this land, had walked up to a stranger's door with nothing but a piece of paper and her own courage. That took a kind of strength Matthew respected. "There," he said, pointing as they crested a rise. "That's your land, starting at that line of rocks. The creek runs through that valley there." Margaret stood up in the wagon seat, shading her eyes against the sun. The land stretched out before them, 200 acres of scrub and sand and possibility. The creek was visible as a ribbon of green, cottonwood trees marking its path through the valley. It wasn't lush by any measure, but in this desert country, water meant life. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, and Matthew heard the wonder in her voice. "It's hard country," he said honestly. "Summers are brutal, water's scarce except for the creek, and the winters can get cold at night. But if you're willing to work for it, you can make a life here." "I am willing." Margaret sat back down, turning to look at him. "I know you didn't ask for this, Matthew. I know having me here complicates your life, but I promise I'll pull my weight. I won't be a burden." "I don't think you could be a burden if you tried," Matthew said, and was rewarded with a smile that transformed Margaret's whole face, making her eyes light up and her cheeks flush. He felt his heart do something complicated in his chest, and turned his attention back to the horses, unsettled by his own reaction. They spent the rest of the daylight hours unloading the supplies and planning where Margaret's house would go. She wanted it near the creek, but not so close that floods would be a danger, on high ground with a view of the valley. Matthew approved of her thinking, showed her where the prevailing winds came from and how to orient the house to catch the breeze in summer and shelter from the cold in winter. "We'll start tomorrow," he said as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple. "I've got lumber from a shed I tore down last year, enough for a small house. 1 room to start, we can add on later if needed. 1 room is more than I've ever had to myself," Margaret said softly. That night, Matthew insisted Margaret take the bed again while he slept by the stove. She protested, but he pointed out that they'd both need rest if they were going to start building tomorrow, and the bed was more comfortable. Lying in the dark, listening to the settling sounds of the house, Matthew thought about his father and the secret he'd kept. Had Samuel loved this Loretta Gaines, Margaret's mother? Had he thought about her over the years, wondered about the life they might have had? Matthew's own mother had been a good woman, quiet and steady, devoted to her family. She died when Matthew was 18, and he'd never thought to question whether his father had loved her. But maybe there were different kinds of love, and maybe Samuel had built a good life with one woman while still carrying memories of another. The thought made Matthew feel strange, like he was seeing his father as a real person for the first time instead of just as a parent. And what about Margaret? She'd lost both her parents, had come out here alone with nothing but a deed and hope. Matthew admired that courage even as it worried him. The desert was unforgiving to the unprepared, and Margaret was so clearly unprepared in so many ways. But she was also smart and determined, and Matthew found himself wanting to help her succeed, wanting to see her make a real home on this land his father had given her. The next morning, they started building. Matthew showed Margaret how to measure and cut the lumber, how to set posts deep enough to withstand the wind, how to square corners and level floors. She learned quickly, her hands becoming sure with the tools, though he could see blisters forming on her palms by midday. They worked in companionable silence broken by occasional questions, the desert sun beating down and sweat soaking through their clothes. "Tell me about your father," Margaret said during a break for water. "What was he like?" Matthew considered the question, taking a long drink from the canteen. "Hard-working. Honest. He didn't talk much, kept things inside, but he was fair and he loved this land." He looked at Margaret. "Did your mother tell you anything about him, just that he was kind, that he wanted to marry her but her family wouldn't allow it?" "He didn't have money then, was just a ranch hand working for someone else." Margaret turned the canteen in her hands. "She married my father instead, a man her parents approved of. I don't think she was ever happy." "And your father," Margaret's face clouded. "He drank, lost jobs." "We moved around a lot when I was growing up, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. When he died, it was almost a relief, and then I felt guilty for thinking that." Matthew reached out and squeezed her shoulder, a brief gesture of comfort. "You can't help what you feel." They worked until the sun set, getting the main frame of the house erected. It was small, just 12 feet square, but it was solid and true, and Matthew could see pride in Margaret's eyes as she looked at what they'd built together. They ate dinner at Matthew's house again, beans and cornbread cooked over the stove, and talked about the next day's work. "We'll get the roof on tomorrow, then start on the walls," Matthew said. "Another week and you'll have a real house." "I never thought I'd own a house," Margaret said quietly. "Never thought I'd have anything that was really mine." "Well, now you do." Matthew smiled at her across the table. "How does it feel?" "Scary," Margaret admitted. "But good. Really good." The days fell into a rhythm after that. They worked on Margaret's house from sunrise to noon. Then Matthew would ride out to check on his cattle while Margaret started working on clearing ground for a garden near the creek. They'd come together again in the evening, sharing meals and conversation. And gradually, Matthew learned more about this woman who'd appeared in his life so unexpectedly. Margaret had grown up moving from town to town across Arizona and New Mexico, never staying anywhere long enough to make real friends. She could read and write, had gone to school when they'd stayed in one place long enough, and she had a quick mind that absorbed everything Matthew taught her about ranching. She was funny in a dry, understated way, and she had opinions about everything from politics to the best way to cook beans. In turn, Matthew found himself talking about things he'd never discussed with anyone. His mother's death and how lost he'd felt afterward. The loneliness of running the ranch alone, the way he sometimes went days without seeing another person. His dreams of expanding the herd, of making the ranch into something that could last generations. Margaret listened with those sharp green eyes, asking questions that made him think, challenging assumptions he hadn't known he was making. By the end of the first week, the house had walls and a roof and a door that hung straight on its hinges. Matthew helped Margaret whitewash the interior, making it bright and clean, and they installed the small stove they'd bought in Keeler. Margaret hung curtains she'd sewn from the fabric, simple white cotton that fluttered in the breeze from the open window. "It's perfect," she said, standing in the middle of the room with her hands on her hips. "It's absolutely perfect." Matthew had to agree. The house was small but well built, snug and weathertight, with a real glass window looking out toward the creek. He'd built a narrow bed frame in one corner and a table with 2 chairs near the stove. There were shelves for supplies and hooks for hanging clothes and a trunk at the foot of the bed for storing things. It was simple, but it was solid, and he felt proud of what they'd accomplished together. "You'll be comfortable here," he said. "Though you're welcome to keep eating dinner with me if you want. Gets lonely cooking for one." Margaret turned to look at him, and something in her expression made Matthew's heart speed up. "I'd like that," she said, "if you're sure you don't mind." "I don't mind," Matthew said, and meant it more than he wanted to examine too closely. That night, Margaret slept in her own house for the first time, and Matthew lay in his bed thinking how strange it felt to have her so close, and yet not under the same roof. He'd gotten used to her presence over the past week, to the sound of her moving around in the morning, to her voice calling out questions about the work. The house felt empty without her, and that realization troubled him. He barely knew this woman. She'd been in his life for just over a week. But already he found himself thinking about her at odd moments, wondering what she was doing, wanting to show her things and hear her thoughts. When she smiled at him, he felt something warm unfold in his chest. When she stood close while they worked, he was acutely aware of her presence, of the smell of soap and sun-warmed skin. Matthew had known women before, had even courted a girl in Keeler a few years back, until she'd married a banker who could offer her an easier life. But this feeling was different, more immediate and intense. Maybe it was because he and Margaret were working together toward a common goal, partners in a way that felt more intimate than simple friendship. Or maybe it was just her, the particular combination of strength and vulnerability that drew him like nothing ever had. He needed to be careful, Matthew told himself firmly. Margaret was his business partner, dependent on him for help and guidance. The last thing she needed was him developing feelings that could complicate their arrangement. He would keep things professional, would honor the partnership they'd created, and would ignore the way his heart jumped every time she smiled. That resolution lasted exactly until the next morning when Matthew rode over to Margaret's house and found her trying to move a heavy water barrel by herself. She'd managed to tip it, but couldn't right it again, and she was straining against the weight with her face red and her arms shaking. "Wait, let me help," Matthew said, swinging down from his horse. Together they lifted the barrel and set it where Margaret wanted it, near the door of the house. When it was in place, Margaret pushed her hair back from her face and grinned at him, breathing hard. "Thank you. I was starting to think I'd have to empty it and start over." Matthew looked at her standing there in her work clothes with the morning sun turning her hair to dark fire, and felt his careful resolution crumble. He was in trouble, he realized. Real trouble. Because somewhere in the past week, he'd started falling for Margaret Gaines, and he had no idea what to do about it. They spent the next few weeks establishing routines and preparing for the work of running a real ranch together. Matthew taught Margaret to ride properly. Not just the basic seat she'd used getting from Phoenix, but the kind of riding needed for ranch work, spending long hours in the saddle moving cattle. She was a natural, he discovered, with good balance and gentle hands on the reins. She learned to rope, practicing on fence posts until she could throw a loop with reasonable accuracy. In turn, Margaret took over some of the household work that Matthew had been doing haphazardly, cooking proper meals and keeping both houses clean. She planted her garden, coaxing seeds into life in the desert soil, and started talking about getting chickens for eggs. She was up before dawn every day and worked until dark, never complaining about the heat or the hard labor. They settled into an easy partnership, working together during the day and sharing dinner most evenings. Matthew found himself looking forward to those dinners, to the conversation and laughter, to the way Margaret would tease him about his cooking or challenge his opinions. She was smart and funny, and she made the lonely ranch house feel like a home for the first time since his mother died. But there were moments when the air between them seemed to crackle with something more than friendship. Times when their hands would brush passing tools and they'd both freeze. Times when Matthew would catch Margaret looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Times when he'd find himself standing too close, breathing in the scent of her, wanting to reach out and touch. He didn't, though. Kept his hands to himself and his thoughts carefully controlled. Margaret was building a new life here, finding independence and purpose. She didn't need him complicating things with unwanted affection. So Matthew worked beside her and taught her, and admired her from a careful distance, and told himself it was enough. Then one afternoon in late June, everything changed. They were moving a small group of cattle to fresh grazing, riding side by side through the heat, when Margaret's horse stepped in a hole and went down hard. Margaret flew from the saddle, hitting the ground with a sickening thud that stopped Matthew's heart. He was off his own horse before he could think, running to where Margaret lay motionless in the dust. "Margaret, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, dazed and unfocused. "What happened?" "Your horse went down. Don't move, you might be hurt." Matthew ran his hands carefully over her arms and legs, checking for breaks. Everything seemed intact, but there was blood on her forehead where she'd hit a rock. "I'm fine," Margaret said, trying to sit up, but Matthew kept a hand on her shoulder. "You're bleeding. Just stay still for a minute." He pulled his bandana off and pressed it gently to the cut on her forehead. "That was a hard fall. I've had worse." But Margaret's voice was shaky, and when Matthew helped her sit up slowly, she swayed against him. Matthew caught her automatically, one arm around her shoulders to steady her, and suddenly they were close, so close he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, could count the freckles across her nose. Margaret's breath hitched, her eyes widening, and Matthew knew she felt it too, this pull between them that had been building for weeks. "Matthew," she whispered, and it sounded like a question and an answer all at once. He should have pulled back. Should have helped her to her feet and checked on her horse and gotten them both back to work. But his body wouldn't obey his brain, and instead, he found himself leaning in, drawn by something stronger than sense or caution. Margaret didn't pull away. If anything, she tilted her face up, her lips parting slightly, and Matthew was lost. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, both of them testing this new territory. But then Margaret's hand came up to cup the back of his neck, and Matthew pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that made his whole body sing. She tasted like dust and sunshine, and kissing her felt like coming home after a long journey. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matthew searched Margaret's face for regret or uncertainty. "I'm sorry," he started, but Margaret pressed her fingers to his lips. "Don't be sorry. I've been wanting you to do that for weeks." Matthew felt something tight in his chest loosen and expand. "You have. Of course I have." Margaret smiled, a little shy but also certain. "I thought you weren't interested. You've been so careful to keep your distance." "I was trying to be professional." "You're my partner and I didn't want to take advantage." "Matthew, Xavier, do I look like someone who could be taken advantage of against my will?" Margaret's tone was tart, but her eyes were warm. "I'm here because I choose to be, and if I want to kiss you, that's my choice too." Matthew laughed, relief and joy bubbling up inside him. "Fair point." He stood, helping Margaret to her feet, and checked the cut on her forehead. It was shallow, already clotting. "You're going to have a bruise, but I think you'll live. Good thing. I have too much work to do to die now." Margaret caught his hand, squeezing it. "So what happens now?" Now we catch your horse, make sure she's not injured, and get these cattle moved, Matthew said practically. And then we figure out the rest. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon. The cattle settled in their new grazing area, and Margaret's mare confirmed to be only shaken up, not hurt. But everything felt different now, charged with possibility and promise. When they reached the house, Matthew helped Margaret down from her horse, his hands lingering on her waist. "Have dinner with me?" he asked, though it was their usual routine anyway. "Always," Margaret said, and kissed him again, sweet and quick, before going to tend to her horse. Matthew watched her go, still feeling the imprint of her lips on his, and thought about his father. Had Samuel felt this way about Loretta Gaines? This mix of joy and terror, this sense of having found something precious and rare. Matthew understood now, in a way he hadn't before, why his father might have signed over land to an old love. When you cared about someone, you wanted to take care of them, to give them whatever you could. That night, they ate dinner together as usual, but there was a new awareness between them, a heat that had nothing to do with the stove. Matthew found himself staring at Margaret's mouth, remembering how it felt to kiss her. Margaret kept catching his eye and blushing, a smile playing at her lips. "We should talk about this," Matthew said finally, pushing his plate away. "About what this means." Margaret nodded, suddenly serious. "I don't want to ruin our partnership. The ranch, the work we're doing together, that's important to me." "It's important to me too," Matthew agreed. "But Margaret, I have to be honest with you. I'm falling in love with you, maybe already have fallen, and I don't think I can go back to just being business partners." Margaret's eyes went wide, shining in the lamplight. "You love me." "I do." Matthew reached across the table, taking her hand. "I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a few weeks, but I've never felt like this before. Like I could spend every day with you and it wouldn't be enough. Like you're the person I want to share everything with, the good and the bad." "Matthew." Margaret's voice was thick with emotion. "I love you too. I didn't want to, tried not to, because I was afraid of getting hurt, but I can't help it. You're kind and patient, and you treat me like an equal. You've given me a chance to build a real life, and you've been beside me every step of the way. How could I not love you?" Matthew stood, pulling Margaret up and into his arms. He kissed her properly, deeply, pouring all his feelings into it. She kissed him back just as fiercely, her arms around his neck, and Matthew felt like his heart might burst from happiness. "Marry me," he said when they came up for air. "I know it's sudden, but I'm sure, Margaret. I want to build this ranch with you, build a life with you. Say yes." Margaret pulled back just far enough to look into his eyes. "Are you sure? You barely know me. What if I'm terrible to live with? What if—" "I know enough," Matthew interrupted. "I know you're strong and brave and stubborn as a mule. I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met. I know you make me laugh and challenge me to be better. That's enough. That's everything." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." They kissed again, and then Matthew was spinning her around the kitchen, both of them laughing like fools. When he set her down, Margaret was flushed and breathless and beautiful. "We can get married in Keeler," Matthew said. "Have the preacher do it at the church. Invite the whole town if you want." "I don't need a big wedding," Margaret said. "I just need you." They were married 3 days later in the small church in Keeler, with the preacher's wife and the lawyer William Porter standing as witnesses. Margaret wore a simple dress she'd had since Phoenix, and Matthew wore his Sunday clothes with his hair slicked back. The ceremony was short and sincere, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Matthew kissed his bride with joy singing through his veins. They spent their wedding night at Margaret's house, the small space feeling like a palace. Matthew was gentle with her, careful and patient, and Margaret responded with a passion that took his breath away. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, the desert night cool through the open window. "I can't believe this is real," Margaret whispered, her head on Matthew's shoulder. "A month ago, I was alone in Phoenix with nothing but a deed and hope. Now I have a home and a partner and a husband who loves me." "It's real," Matthew assured her, kissing her forehead. "And it's just the beginning. We're going to build something amazing together, Margaret. I can feel it." The summer passed in a blur of work and love and building their life together. Margaret moved into Matthew's house, which they now called theirs, and her small cabin became a storage shed and workshop. They expanded the herd, buying more cattle with the money they'd saved, and Margaret proved herself as capable a rancher as any man Matthew had known. By fall, the ranch was thriving. The cattle were fat on good grazing. Margaret's garden had produced enough vegetables to stock their cellar for winter, and they'd even acquired a small flock of chickens that provided eggs daily. Margaret had a natural head for business, keeping careful records of their expenses and profits, and together they were making the ranch into something that could provide a real living. But more than the work, Matthew treasured the small moments of their married life. Waking up with Margaret warm beside him, sharing coffee on the porch while they watched the sunrise, coming in from a hard day's work to find dinner cooking and Margaret smiling at him. They fit together in ways he'd never expected, complementing each other's strengths and covering each other's weaknesses. Margaret had bloomed in the months since she'd arrived, filling out on regular meals and losing the gaunt, haunted look she'd had. She laughed more, teased him mercilessly, and showed a playful side that made his days brighter. And at night, in the privacy of their bedroom, she showed him a passionate nature that never failed to leave him breathless and grateful. By November, Margaret started feeling sick in the mornings, and they both knew what it meant before the doctor in Keeler confirmed it. A baby, due in late spring. Matthew was terrified and thrilled in equal measure, but Margaret seemed to take it in stride. "Of course there's a baby," she said practically. "With the way we carry on, it would be more surprising if there wasn't." Matthew laughed and pulled her into his arms, marveling at the life growing inside her. "We're going to need to add on to the house," he said. "Build a nursery." "Next year," Margaret said, "after the baby comes and we see how much sleep we're getting." The winter was mild that year, and they used the quieter months to plan for the future. Matthew taught Margaret everything he knew about ranching, and she absorbed it all with that quick mind of hers. They talked about expanding their water sources, maybe digging a well, about breeding their best cattle to improve the herd. They talked about the baby, choosing names and arguing cheerfully about whether a son should learn to rope or ride first. "Both at once," Margaret insisted. "Start them young." "They have to be able to walk first," Matthew pointed out, and Margaret conceded the point with a laugh. In February, they received a letter that changed everything. William Porter wrote to inform them that a railroad company was planning to run a line near Keeler, and they were looking for reliable beef suppliers. It was an opportunity to expand beyond the local market, to sell their cattle for real money to feed the workers building the railroad. Matthew and Margaret talked late into the night, weighing the risks and rewards. It would mean taking on debt to expand the herd faster, would mean harder work and longer hours. But it could also mean real prosperity, the kind of security that would let them build the ranch into something lasting. "Let's do it," Margaret said finally. "We didn't come this far to play it safe." They met with the railroad representatives in March, Margaret heavily pregnant but insisting on being part of the negotiations. The men were surprised to find themselves dealing with a woman, but Margaret held her ground, driving hard bargains and refusing to be talked down to. By the end of the meeting, they had a contract to supply beef starting in the fall, at prices that made Matthew's head spin. "We did it," he said as they rode home, still stunned. "We're going to be all right, more than all right." "I know," Margaret said, and her smile was radiant. Their son was born on a warm night in May, a healthy boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes. They named him Samuel, after Matthew's father, and when Matthew held his son for the first time, he thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. His father's old love, the deed given in secret, Margaret appearing on his doorstep with nothing but courage and hope. It was all tangled together, love and loss and new beginnings. "Thank you," Matthew whispered to his father's memory. "Thank you for bringing her to me." The months after Samuel's birth were chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. The baby was healthy but demanding, and Margaret divided her time between caring for him and helping run the ranch. Matthew did more than his share of the household work, washing diapers and rocking the baby at night so Margaret could sleep, and never once complained. This was his family, the life he'd built with the woman he loved, and every hard moment was worth it. By fall, they were delivering their first herd to the railroad, and the money they earned was more than Matthew had seen in his entire life. They paid off their debts, bought more cattle, and finally built the addition to the house that they'd been planning, adding 2 bedrooms and expanding the kitchen. The railroad contract continued, year after year, and the ranch grew with it. They hired hands to help with the work, young men from Keeler who were glad for the employment. Margaret managed the business side of things, keeping the books and negotiating with buyers, while Matthew handled the day-to-day operation of the ranch. Together, they were formidable. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the ranch and the animals. He was riding before he could barely walk, just as Margaret had predicted, and he followed Matthew around asking endless questions about everything. When he was 3, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, a sweet-tempered baby who had her father wrapped around her tiny finger from day one. The years passed in a rhythm of work and family and love. The ranch prospered, growing from a modest operation into one of the most successful in the territory. Matthew and Margaret built a legacy together, something solid and lasting that they could pass on to their children. They added more land, dug wells, built outbuildings and corrals. The small ranch Matthew's father had started became something impressive. But through all the growth and success, what Matthew valued most was the partnership he had with Margaret. She was his equal in every way, his partner in business and in life. They made decisions together, supported each other through hard times, celebrated victories side by side. And at night, in the privacy of their bedroom, they still came together with the same passion and love that had brought them together all those years ago. On their 10th anniversary, Matthew took Margaret out to the spot where her house had stood, the small cabin now long since converted to other uses. They stood looking out over the land she'd claimed with nothing but a deed and determination, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "You ever regret it?" Matthew asked. "Coming here, taking this risk?" Margaret turned to him, her hand finding his automatically. "Not for a single moment. This is the life I was meant to live. With you." "I love you," Matthew said, the words as true now as they'd been the first time he'd said them. "Thank you for knocking on my door that night. Thank you for being stubborn and brave and refusing to give up." "I love you too," Margaret said, and kissed him as the sun sank below the horizon. "Thank you for looking at that deed and seeing possibility instead of just a problem. Thank you for building this life with me." They walked back to the house hand in hand, passing the corrals full of healthy cattle, the barn they'd built 5 years ago, the chicken coop that was Margaret's pride and joy. Through the windows of the house, they could see lamplight and movement as their children played inside, watched over by the housekeeper they'd hired to help Margaret. This was home, Matthew thought. Not just the land or the buildings, but the life they'd created together. The family they'd built, the legacy they were leaving. And it had all started with a knock on the door and a deed with his father's handwriting bringing him the love of his life. As they reached the porch, Samuel came running out, 5-year-old Rose toddling behind him. "Papa, Mama, come see what we built." Matthew scooped up his daughter while Margaret took Samuel's hand, and together they went inside to see whatever creation their children had made. The house was warm and bright, filled with the sounds of family and life, and Matthew felt his heart overflow with gratitude and love. This was everything he'd never known he wanted, everything he'd needed without realizing it. And it had all come from the most unlikely beginning, a stranger with a deed and a dream, brave enough to claim what was hers and generous enough to share it with him. Years later, when Matthew was gray-haired and watching his grandchildren play in the yard of the ranch that now sprawled across thousands of acres, he would think back to that evening when Margaret had knocked on his door. He would remember the shock of seeing his father's handwriting, the uncertainty of those first days, the moment he'd realized he was falling in love. And he would be grateful, so grateful, for whatever impulse had driven his father to give that land to Margaret Gaines, because it had brought Margaret into his life. Samuel grew up to be a fine rancher himself, eventually taking over more and more of the operation as Matthew slowed down. Rose married a schoolteacher and moved to Phoenix, but visited often with her own children. The ranch continued to prosper, adapting to changing times while staying true to the foundation Matthew and Margaret had built. On their 30th anniversary, Matthew surprised Margaret with a trip to Phoenix, staying in a fancy hotel and eating in restaurants with white tablecloths. It was a far cry from their hardscrabble early days, but Margaret insisted it wasn't the luxury that made her happy. "I would have been just as content in that one-room cabin," she said as they sat on the hotel balcony watching the city lights, "as long as I was with you." "I know," Matthew said, pulling her close, "but you deserve nice things after everything you've done, everything you've built." "We built it together," Margaret corrected. "That's what made it special, not the success or the money but the partnership, the love." Matthew kissed her temple, breathing in the scent of her, still as intoxicating after 30 years as it had been the first time he'd held her. "I'm a lucky man, Margaret Xavier." "We're both lucky," Margaret said. "We found each other against all odds and we built something beautiful." They returned to the ranch renewed and happy, ready for whatever years they had left together. Matthew's health began to decline when he was in his 60s. A weak heart, the doctor said, and he had to give up the harder physical work of ranching. But he could still ride out to check on the cattle with Samuel, could still sit on the porch with Margaret and watch the sunset over the land they loved. Margaret remained strong and sharp even as the years passed, managing the business side of things well into her 70s. She was respected throughout the territory as a savvy businesswoman and a generous neighbor, someone who had helped build the community and supported it in return. Young women came to her for advice on starting their own businesses, and she gave it freely, remembering what it had been like to arrive with nothing and need help. On a warm evening in late spring, 42 years after Margaret had first knocked on his door, Matthew sat on the porch with his wife, holding her hand and watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard. He felt tired in a deep way that had nothing to do with the day's work and everything to do with a life well lived. "I need to tell you something," he said to Margaret, who turned to him with those green eyes that still made his heart skip. "In case I don't get another chance. You made my life mean something. Before you came, I was just going through the motions, working the ranch because it was what I knew. but you brought purpose and joy and love. You made everything better." Margaret squeezed his hand, tears shining in her eyes. "Matthew Xavier, you better not be saying goodbye to me. We have years left." "I hope so," Matthew said. "But just in case, I love you. I have loved you from the moment you stood on my porch with that deed, looking scared and fierce all at once, and I will love you beyond whatever comes next." "I love you too," Margaret said, her voice breaking, "always and forever." Matthew did have more years, as it turned out. 4 more good years, where he got to see his grandchildren grown and starting families of their own, where he got to watch the ranch continue to thrive under Samuel's capable management, where he got to hold Margaret every night and wake up beside her every morning. When he finally passed peacefully in his sleep at 68, Margaret was beside him. She mourned him deeply but without bitterness, grateful for the life they'd shared and the love that had sustained them through 4 decades together. She lived another 10 years, staying sharp and active until the very end, watching over the ranch and the family they'd built with pride and satisfaction. Margaret was laid to rest beside Matthew in the small cemetery outside Keeler, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names and the dates of their lives. But their real monument was the ranch itself, still thriving under the management of their descendants, still watered by the creek that ran through Margaret's original 200 acres. The deed that had brought them together was framed and hung in the ranch house, a reminder of unlikely beginnings and the courage it took to claim what was yours. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, the family would gather on the porch and tell the story of how it all began, with a knock on the door and a piece of paper bearing a father's handwriting and a stranger's name, and how that single moment had changed everything. It was a love story for the ages, built on partnership and respect and the kind of deep, abiding love that only comes from working side by side through hardship and triumph. Matthew and Margaret had built more than a ranch. They'd built a life, a family, a legacy that would endure for generations. And it had all started with the bravest thing either of them had ever done: Margaret's decision to claim her inheritance, and Matthew's decision to honor his father's wishes and see where it led. Where it led was to everything. To love and partnership, to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their legacy forward, to a ranch that had started as a struggling operation and became a cornerstone of the community, to a marriage that lasted through 46 years and beyond, into whatever comes after this life. The land remained in the family, passed down through generations, each one adding to what Matthew and Margaret had built. The creek still flowed through the valley, giving life to cattle and crops, just as it had when Margaret first saw it and knew she'd found home. The house was expanded and modernized over the years, but the core remained, the rooms where Matthew and Margaret had lived and loved and raised their family. And on certain evenings, when the light was just right and the desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods, you could almost feel them there still, Matthew and Margaret, walking the land they'd claimed together, their love as enduring as the ancient rocks and endless sky, a testament to what 2 people could build when they chose to believe in each other and in the possibility of tomorrow.